So, open your Bibles to Job chapter 12. While you guys are at it, have you ever been so mad at somebody who's kind of making false accusations that you start down a path and then you use words that you wish you could have taken back? When you dictate a text. Well, you know what? Job's kind of in that same spot here in Job chapter 12. So let's pick it up in verse 1 and then we'll dive into it verse by verse. It says, "Then Job answered and said, 'No doubt you are the people, and wisdom will die with you. But I have understanding as well as you. I am not inferior to you. Indeed, who does not know things as these? I am one mocked by his friends, who called on God, and he answered him. The just and the blameless, who is ridiculed. A lamp is despised in the thought of one who is at ease. It is made ready for those whose feet slip.'" Now, as we go through this, we're using a lot of terminology that was common to them, but our vernacular, we're like, what does that mean? So we'll go over that. "The tents of the robbers prosper, and those who provoke God are secure in what God provides by his hand. But now ask the beasts, and they will teach you, and the birds of the air, and they will tell you. Or speak to the earth, and it will teach you, and the fish of the sea will explain to you. Who among all these does not know that the hand of the Lord has done this? In whose hand is the life of every living thing, and the breath of all mankind? Does not the ear test words, and the mouth taste its food? Wisdom is with aged men, and the length of days understanding. With him are wisdom and strength. He has counsel and understanding. If he breaks a thing down, it cannot be rebuilt. If he imprisons a man, there can be no release. If he withholds the water, they dry up. If he sends them out, they overwhelm the earth. With him are strength and prudence. The deceived and the deceiver are his. He leads counselors away plundered and makes fools of the judges. He loosens the bonds of kings and binds their waist with a belt. He leads princes away plundered and overthrows the mighty. He deprives the trusted ones of speech and takes away the discernment of the elders. He pours contempt on priests." If it says princes, move it. It's priests. "And disarms the mighty. He uncovers deep things out of darkness and brings the shadow of death to light. He makes nation great and destroys them. He enlarges nations and guides them. He takes away understanding of the chiefs of the people of the earth and makes them wander in a pathless wilderness. They grope in the dark without light, and he makes them stagger like a drunk man." Now, as we go through this, we were missing quite a few people, so I'm going to give you a little bit more than what we went on last week. I want you guys to consider Job's point of view when all of this is taking place. He is not allowed to see behind the curtain that we have. He has no idea that this is basically, I hate to say it like this, but this is basically a challenge between God and Satan. God knows who's going to win, right? But God's going to use Job to prove his point. The problem is Job's the one that's getting hurt by all of this, it seems. God knew how this was going to end before Satan ever even approached him, right? And so that should tell you that God has a lot of faith in Job, because he's going to allow him to go through this turmoil. He's going to allow him to go through this trial. He's going to test Job's faith, knowing that Job's going to come out on the other side just fine. But Satan doesn't know that either. So that should be one of the clues that tells you that Satan's not omnipotent. He's not all-knowing. He's not omniscient. He's not any of the things of God. He's a created being that can only be at one place at a time. Now, the complaint that Satan has against Job is really that he is upright and blameless. He's one who fears God and shuns evil. So Satan's charge is that God's playing favorites. Basically, Satan comes up and says, Job is a spoiled daddy's boy. Anyone would follow you is the accusation if they were blessed like that. The idea is that the only reason Job follows you, the only reason Job worships you is because you bless him. All right. How many of you guys have seen the show Entourage, or even look at anything like that, where you see that you have one person who is rich and spoiled, and so they have all of the people that cling on to them as they go everywhere thinking they're just as important? They're not, right? Nobody's that important in the first place. But that's the idea, is that God's the one that's in charge, and that Job is just one of those Klingons that he's getting the benefit. But soon as tragedy strikes, in a sense, he'll run, he'll flee to the mountains, he'll go his own way. Now, God answers Satan's challenge by thinning, not removing, but thinning the hedge of protection that's around him. God said in the first case, don't touch him. Now, with that, Job loses his entire family. He loses all of his material possessions. In fact, in Job 21, it's for 121, he says, naked I came from my mother's womb, naked I shall return there. The Lord gave and the Lord takes away. Blessed be the name of the Lord, right? Soon as Job says that, Satan starts to panic. His world has just been rocked, and he's still giving blessings to God. So, what does Satan do? He runs back to Papa. And he goes, well, if you only take away his health, then he'll really do it. God goes, okay, just don't kill him. So, immediately, Job is struck with leprosy. They just crusty, nasty boils. We'll stop right there. Because you guys know how, I could show pictures if you wanted. Yeah, one's in the back going, oh yeah, cool. Now, in all of this, Job is holding fast to the thing is, I haven't sinned like that. I don't deserve this type of punishment for the sinning that I have done. All right? So even Job's caught in this idea that the greater the punishment, the greater the sin must have been. Now, Joy asked a question 2 weeks ago and asked, how quickly did all of this happen? Well, this is how quickly it happened. On day one, Satan brings charges against Job. Job loses all of his wealth. He loses his 10 children, and it's the beginning of the burial preparations. This is where he says, the Lord gives, the Lord takes away, is at the end of day one. Okay, day two, possibly day three, because if there's a Shabbat in the middle, but we're just going to call it day two, Satan brings the additional charges against Job. Job buries his children before sundown, and then in the afternoon or evening, that's when Job develops the painful boils. He goes and sits in the ash pile outside the city, and he brings that potsherd as a scraper. At the end of that day, Job's wife comes and says that it's your fault. Do you still hold fast to your integrity? Then she says to him, curse God and die. She's hurting too, so she's lashing out at Job. She lost her 10 kids too, right? But since he's the head of the family, she's blaming him for all this calamity. She, again, believes the same thing that his friends are bringing, that, well, you must have sinned in some big bad way that I don't know about. Day 4 is the beginning of the Shiva, which is the 7 days of quiet mourning. That's the morning his friends arrive. Eliphaz, who speaks of man's wisdom. You have Bildad, the anthropologist naturalist, and you have Zophar, who's the Pharisee/Sadducee. That's the mindset that he has, yes. Are these theoretical days or? No, these were literal days. So this is when they would come. So you have to understand that the custom to bury has to happen in 24 to 48 hours, depending upon if there's a Shabbat in there or not. Okay? Now, I do have to say this. Is Job Jewish? No, he's not. But it seems to be following the customs of the day for the area. Okay? He's also going to make other allusions, especially in this chapter, to events that we see elsewhere in the Bible. But Job is not Jewish. He's, for lack of a better term, an Edomite. He comes from Esau's side of things. Okay? Then on day 11, the Shiva is over. It's quiet, right? Now, Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar bring the charges against Job. It's been 11 days. For those of you who have lost people, can you imagine that on just less than 2 weeks later, your friends come up to you and tell you that that person died because they deserved to die because God found them to be evil? That's the charge Bildad brings. Yes.
This
This is after Abraham, about the time of Esau, Jacob, Isaac time period. There's a good chance that Abraham was actually still alive when this book was written. What we do is we go through the lineage of, he's an Ishmaelite, not an Edomite. I take that back. We go through the lineage of Ishmael. We see a Jobe, Jobe, and Job is a shortened version of that word. There's a lot of scholars that believe that they're one and the same. When they date this book, it dates to the time of Isaac. Does that give you guys an idea of what's going on? Because remember, even though we learn the story about Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, Genesis was written by who? It was written by Moses, right? What was the time period? Around 1500 BC. So, right.
It wasn't directly curse God, it was some of the way she put it. But was that blasphemy?
Yeah, she wants him to blaspheme God so that he just gets taken out.
So is God considered that blasphemy?
On her part, yes. Yes. He would, and he'll charge her with that at a later date. So, that gives you an idea how quick these events are happening to poor Job. Like I said, we're 11 days into this thing. These are the conversations that they're having. And already, all three of them have said, the reason that you're here, the reason you're suffering so, is because you have some sin in your life. Eliphaz says, well, I had a dream, and it was a special sin that you need to reveal to us, right? It's secret. You're not telling us. And then you have Bildad who comes in, and basically he says, well, let's look at how God works in nature. If this happens, then this happens. And the idea being that if you're being punished like this, God has to punish sin. And then Bildad uses the idea of God being the grand gardener and that wicked people are weeds. And then that's what he uses basically to say that your children were weeds that were just plucked out. They were evil and God just threw them away. That would be the idea of the tares and the wheat. The difference between tares and wheat, though, is you can't pull tares without pulling the wheat because they're so intermingled. But what he's talking about here is just a standard garden, right? And that when you go and weed a garden, now you have the pieces of the garden which are fruitful. Those are the godly people. And then you have the wicked people who are the weeds. And the wicked oftentimes try to find shelter in the rocks. The idea is that they try to dig their roots underneath, so it's more difficult to pull them out. But basically what Bildad says is that you're next, buddy, because God's just giving you a little bit of time. If you don't get right with him, you're next. But your kids, yeah, they were taken out because they deserved it. And then you have Zophar. He comes in and he's the Pharisee. The thing about Zophar in chapter 11 is I really see a connection to Jesus there. Because Job hasn't done anything wrong, but they keep bringing charges against him. Zophar comes from the opinion of, well, since God's not speaking up, I'm going to speak up for him. The thing is that Job has never said that he's without sin. He says that I don't deserve what I am getting, that the punishment does not fit the crime. In fact, in chapter 9, he goes, I need a mediator between me and God. Oh, okay. He goes, if there was a mediator, I could plead my case, but without one, I have to defend myself. And even if I were able to speak to God, to try to defend myself, I can't make myself pure enough to stand before God. God is God and I am not, and he understands that. But the thing is that he wants to be able to reason with God, but he knows he can't approach God because he's a sinful creature. So he's got part of it right. What he's forgetting, not understanding, is the mediator part. But then in chapter 10, he starts getting a little angry and he says, but if I could only talk to God, this is what I would say. He would say, what did I do to deserve this? Please show me. And then he goes into, you're God, you know my thoughts. You know that I've done all the right things. Why are you treating me? And he makes the allegation, why are you treating me unjustly? It would be like somebody going in and stealing a Tootsie Roll and then getting a life sentence. That's kind of what he feels has happened. That instead of just having to pay for a fine and get a ticket, he's been found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. The one part that we don't see on Job's side of things, we don't see on Bildad's side of things, Eliphaz's side of things, is that we've all sinned and fallen short. See, they're looking at it from man's perspective. Man's perspective is that sin's a sliding scale. But that's not how God does things, right? All it takes is one. Because God is pure, God is holy. For a human being, all it takes is that first sin to separate us from God. That's where that mediator that he's crying out for comes in. Job's closing statement in chapter 10 is, leave me alone. Let me live my few days in peace because, God, you're sending me to hell. I know it. That's really what he's saying. Can I just have this time without you beating me up? I'll just stay in my ash pit. I'll just do the things that I need to do, and I'll be dead in a week. And then, God, I know that you're sending me to hell. So Job is really bound to this idea that he is being punished more than he deserves, but he's looking at, without this mediator, what awaits him is hell. I think that that's a pretty interesting point that Job's trying to make, or God's making through Job, is the idea that if he had a mediator, then he could petition for either a lighter sentence or dismissal of the charges. But because he doesn't have a mediator, he doesn't realize he has one, but in his mind, where he's speaking, he goes, I don't have a mediator. What's awaiting him? Judgment. It's hell. It's not the paradise side of Sheol, it's the hell side of Sheol. Now in chapter 11, you have Zophar, who was the legalist. He's the one that says, well, how dare you? I'm going to speak for God on this one. And basically, Zophar is coming from the position that him, Bildad, and Eliphaz, because they are material blessed and not encountering trials right now, that they must therefore be more righteous than Job. They look at their material position and say, well, because these are all men of renown and money, they're looking at that whole thing going, well, I'm not nearly as bad as you. I'm not getting punished like that. Therefore, I have the right to pass judgment upon you. How many of you guys know people that are like that? That think that because they're in a different place than you are, and God has you on a different path, that therefore what you're enduring must be a punishment from God because I'm not going through it. In fact, Zophar, he's acting like a prosecuting attorney, thinking that God needs people like him to take and do God's cases. Does God need people like him? No. Because what does Jesus say about the whole thing? All have sinned and fallen short, right? That we're not supposed to look at somebody who's down and out. We should be looking and saying, but for the grace of God go I. Now, Zophar is the worst of the three as far as just outright accusing Job. He looks at him and says, you're a liar and a hypocrite. The thing is that just like the Sadducees, just like the Pharisees, Zophar has pushed God so far away that he forgot the God portion of it. Remember in, I can't remember what it was, but I think it's, I should have looked this one up. Remember when, I think it's in Malachi, but it says, basically, I do not desire your sacrifices, I desire your obedience, is what is being said, right? Obedience is better than sacrifice, because this, exactly, that's the point that God's making when that statement's made. Well, these guys are, but the thing is that the Pharisees and the Sadducees, right, they were so embedded in the law that they forgot. Jesus tells them, you forgot the other things of the law, like mercy, like grace, like the good things, right? What you've done is here's God, and you've put a barrier around God and keep the people so far away because you're afraid they're going to cross that line. So even though the line may be, say, 2 meters outside of the target, they put up the barriers 100 miles away. Now they can't even see God. They're so worried about all of this stuff out here that the relationship's broken. Jesus came to restore the relationship. It's one of the reasons why they hated him so much. Because when they would say something to him, he would correct them and say, wait a second, what you're bringing up is dogma, or this rabbi said this rabbi said this. Jesus says, no, but God says, but I say. Trying to pull people back into that idea that God is mercy and grace and love, that he's not so much concerned about the sacrifice as he is about the obedience. And part of that obedience comes down to loving your neighbor as yourself, right? What's the first commandment? Or should I say the greatest commandment? Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your soul, and with all your strength, right? And then Jesus says, and the second's like it, meaning the second's equal to it. Love your neighbor as yourself. And all of these are law and the prophets. Well, what the Sadducees and Pharisees were doing was missing the whole love portion in the whole thing. They thought they were by being obedient to God, they thought they were showing love. What they were missing was the relationship part. The interesting thing is all three of them have this understanding, though, that if he were just to confess his sin, God would be faithful and just to forgive him and restore him. So they have it right in certain areas, but they have it way wrong in other areas. So when we get into verse 12, Job's just now spouting off. He's kind of upset. He's going to talk back to him in a sense saying, well, you didn't give me anything else that I didn't know. In verse 1 and 2 it says, then Job answered and said, no doubt you are the people, and wisdom will die with you, which meaning you three seem to have all the answers, and you must be the wisest people on the earth. And when you die, all that wisdom will be lost. I mean, he's being really sarcastic here. And then he kind of starts to chide him a little bit. In verse 3, he says, but I have understanding as well as you. I'm not inferior to you. And that's true, because in the eyes of God, this is where he's making that claim, right? In the eyes of God, I'll put it this way. The ground is level at the foot of the cross. God doesn't see one person better than another person. He sees us all equal. The idea, think about infinite love. Each one of us gets that. He says, but I have understanding. Indeed, who does not know such things as these? You haven't told me anything I don't know. In fact, Junior over there knows all of these things. You're not, and what they're saying is true, but it doesn't apply to his particular case. They're being jerks. They're accusing him rather than coming alongside him and help him. See, that's the contrast between Job's friends and what Christians are supposed to be doing. We're not supposed to be Eliphaz. We're not supposed to be Zophar. We're not supposed to be Bildad. But we see it all the time in the church. When somebody stumbles, we go in and kick them while they're down, and the rumor is that we eat our wounded. Because that's what these guys are doing. That's the example. They really aren't. It's interesting because what they've done is reality television, right? While he's down, they just keep stabbing him in the back and so that they can climb higher. They want him to be the first one off the island, right? And the other thing that they're doing is they're really trying to get him to confess his sin to them. You don't have to confess your sin to any man. Our high priest is alive and well and sitting at the right hand of God, and he makes intercession for us. He's the one you need to talk to. He's the one that you need to tell you're sorry to. In verse 4, he goes, I am one mocked by his friends who called on God, and he answered him. And the just and blameless who is ridiculed. A lamp is despised in the thought of one who is at ease. It is made ready for those whose feet slip. Basically saying, he goes, you're supposed to be my friends. You accused me of mockery. This is back in 11:3. Yet you're the ones mocking me and making me look like a fool. And remember, this isn't happening in isolation. Where is he sitting? In the ash heap. The ash heap is outside the city walls. So as soon as voices got raised, you guys remember high school. You remember that, hey, fight, 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 right? What happened? Where did everybody go? To where the fight was, right? They didn't have internet. They didn't have Nintendo. They didn't have all of the games that keep them distracted. This was the highlight of their day, was to go see this debate happen. So everybody from the township, and it's not a small township, are there. And they're mocking him. But in chapter 11, they said that he was mocking them. Now, the one thing that he does, have you ever had an argument or you got called in and it was something that you didn't do, but you get called into HR for it? Whatever you want to call it. But you go walking in and an allegation has been thrown your direction and it's out of the blue and you're not guilty of it. Have you ever fallen back on the, hey, listen, you know it's me. Would I do something like that? And all of a sudden, there's not a problem anymore. This is the same argument that Job's using. He goes, you accuse me of mockery, but this is me. This is Job. I do everything out in the open. I don't do it out in quiet. Nobody's brought any charges against me. In fact, guys, I'm the one who calls on God and God answers those prayers. That's the type of relationship I had with him. And you know what? When I pray, I expect an answer. You have seen this. It shows that I am a just and upright man. And what a difference 11 days can make, huh? You scorn and despise me because I have fallen into misfortune. And all the while, you do so, sitting so comfortably. They're high and mighty because judgment hasn't befallen them. There's no sympathy or empathy that comes from them. They're past judgment rather than compassion. You know, one of the amazing things about this fellowship is the fact that so many people have gone through so many medical trials that we can relate. We can say, yeah, I know. What can I do? What can I help? Because they remember what it was like when they were struggling. And I mean, the only thing that tasted good was oatmeal, but you didn't want to get out of bed to get it. So somebody brings over the pot pie, you know, like the one you get at major markets that's about this big and feeds you for 10 days. And you're like, oh, that's such a saving grace. It's true. You know, Tommy gained 20 pounds the last time you helped him. That's right.
I don't know what I did, but then they took 10 pounds right off.
So. And then when we get to chapter 6, basically Job's telling them, you're full of hot air. They're not as wise as they think they are. In verse 6, he goes, the tents of robbers prosper, and those who provoke God are secure in what God provides by his hand. God does not always punish the wicked. Have you ever just noticed and said, how can somebody get away with that? I was thinking of the one that's running for president, but the thing is that on both sides, the thing is that God doesn't always take and destroy the wicked. Now, what awaits them is the lake of fire, right? And torment. But don't think that God doesn't love that individual. Don't think that God's long-suffering is confused with acceptance of the sin. God doesn't like the sin. He doesn't tolerate the sin, but God's long-suffering, hoping that they will make that decision for him. And he gives them till that very last second to do so. Isn't that wonderful and amazing God? So God doesn't always punish the wicked. The robbers do tend to prosper. Look at our banks around the world. God seems to, if you were to stand back and look and say this is all divine providence, you go, gosh, God really seems to be providing for them and we're just eking by. And these are people who don't serve any God but themselves. And then in verse 7, Job goes, but now ask the beasts, and they will teach you. The birds of the air, they will tell you, or speak to the earth, it will teach you. The fish of the sea will explain it to you. Who among these does not know that the hand of the Lord has done this? You seem wise in your so-called wisdom, but you've not told me anything that I don't already know. If I could speak to the creatures of the world, they would tell me what you have told me, that it's all God, that every created thing God made. In verse 10 it says, in whose hand is the life of every living thing and the breath of all mankind. He's right. I love it when we start looking into quantum physics because they start realizing that, wait a second, our universe shouldn't exist. There's some missing pieces that if we don't find them, they're sure that we're just going to disappear in a vapor. I can tell you what it is. It's God. It's his thoughts, right? In verse 11, he says, does not the ear test words and the mouth taste its food? The idea is that the task of the ear is to discriminate between the wise and the unwise. The task of the mouth is to discriminate between things that taste good and bad and what you speak. Verse 12, wisdom is with aged men, and with the length of days, understanding. This is a mockery as well as a truism. Because the people that are there talking to him are supposed to be aged and wise. You're coming to me from a position of, with age comes wisdom and understanding. But the reason it's an accusation we're going to find in the next is because they really don't know diddly squat. In verse 13, he says it's with him, God, our wisdom and strength. He has counsel and understanding. He's contrasting the two. You think you know, you don't, but God does. Only with God is there wisdom. Only with God is there true understanding that gives right counsel. This is a pretty hard charge against his friends. They're not using what God has said in their arguments to support their arguments. They're using worldly counsel. Remember, Eliphaz comes from a land known for its wisdom. It would be the equivalent of us talking about Plato and Socrates today, during that time. Bildad, well, he seems to know the nature of things because he looks at things around him, and Zophar thinks he knows the law. But he's been so far removed from it, he picks and chooses. He's kind of new age, right? I'll take the parts that I like and I'll apply them to me, and I'm not going to necessarily apply the grace and mercy parts. Not to you anyways, but I'll apply them and I'll ask for them for myself. When you're counseling somebody, and you're doing biblical counseling, and you start with the words, well, I feel, or the words, I think that God, you better stop right there, okay? Because at that moment, you're on very shaky ground, and what you're doing is you're putting your will before God's will. You know, one of the hardest things that I've had to learn as both an elder and as a pastor over the years is how to counsel marriage counseling. Because a lot of cases, one of them is my friend. Okay? And the flesh in me wants to say, yes, I'll do this, right? But if I go in that way, I'm not being his instrument, right? I have to throw the Bible down and put it right in front of them and say, do you agree that this is the Word of God? And they go, yes. You're going to agree that we need to abide by what God says? Yes. Okay, let's find out what God says about these things. And that's where you have to come from. You have to say, the Bible says this. And you have to be very cautious not to take something out of context either. We need to, when we start with counsel with anybody. Let me ask you this question. How many of you ladies had a girlfriend that was jilted by a boyfriend or a husband? And you go to the place and it's, like 6 or 7 of them. Guys do the same thing. I tend to see the ladies agree with me more on this. But all of a sudden, they're like, well, if I were you, I would take him for every penny he was worth. Well, if I were you, I would make sure that I get the house. If I were you, I would make sure that the children come with me. If I were you, right? There's not one, or there might be one saying, no, the Bible says that we're to avoid contention. You two need to go back and work it out. See, that's godly wisdom. But worldly wisdom is, well, you should get the house. Make sure you get the car. Make sure you clean out the bank accounts. Oh, did you know you could get half of his retirement? Tell me I'm wrong. That's the difference between worldly wisdom and godly wisdom. And we need to make sure that when we give that counsel, that it's godly wisdom. God uses the marriage to show his goodness. The idea being that in a man and a woman you have the full counsel of God in the idea of the attributes of God. And he holds marriage very, very sacred. So Satan loves to see them break up. God, on the other hand, wants them to say, hey, get over yourselves. Bend, don't break. Verse 14, it says, if he breaks things down, he cannot be rebuilt. If he imprisons a man, then there can be no relax. If he withholds the water, they dry up. If he sends them out, they overwhelm the earth. Folks, he's talking about Sodom and Gomorrah and the flood right here. Remember that he comes from the time of Abraham, or thereabouts. Sodom and Gomorrah are pretty fresh in their mind, right? And the flood's only about 700 years. And these guys are living to be, what, 170 plus years old? So, when God tears down something, it will not, nor cannot be rebuilt unless God allows it. But the allusion is to Sodom and Gomorrah. If he hedges a man using circumstances, then nobody can release that man. God will do what God needs to bring glory to his name and to his purpose, right? When drought comes, it's because God does it. But the problem with drought that we so oftentimes think about how many people die in drought. Think of Ethiopia, think of Africa. It was no different. Irrigation that we have today is actually pretty modern. And then there's just the opposite. What happens when we have too much water? There's floods and everything else, right? How many times do we look at that and go, this has to be a judgment from God? This is where Job's getting on shaky ground. This is where he's starting to say things that he has to be careful. In verse 16, he says, with him, with God, are strength and prudence. The deceived and the deceiver are his, which they are. But regardless of what man may think, God is God and we are not. God has the strength and power to carry out his will, and he has the wisdom to design the course of events so that that strength and power will cause those things, right? Now, Isaiah 45 tells us that what God does, he's done openly. He hasn't ever hid it from anybody. It says, for thus says the Lord who created the heavens, who is God, who formed the earth and made it, who has established it, who did not create it in vain, who formed it to be inhabited. I am the Lord and there is no other. Okay? He's saying, hey, you really don't have a right to question me. Verse 19, I have not spoken in secret. He's given us his word. He's told us these things. He's allowed us to know what is sin and what is not sin. He's told us of his Redeemer. He said that we should put our faith in him long before Jesus showed up on the scene. In a dark place of the earth, I did not say to the seed of Jacob, seek me in vain. I, the Lord, speak righteous. I declare that things that are right. Notice that. If God says something is right, don't you dare try to tell him he's wrong. Assemble yourselves and come, draw near together, you who have escaped from the nations, they have no knowledge, who carry the wood of their carved images and pray to a God that cannot save. So, come out of that and come to me. But folks, if you're stuck in that and you stay in that, he can't save you. That little carved idol won't do it. Tell and bring forth your case. Yes, let them take counsel together. Who has declared this from ancient time? Who has told it from that time? Have not I, the Lord? He's been speaking to people all along. Have not I, the Lord? And is there no other God besides me? A just God and a Savior. There is none beside me. This is Isaiah. This is pre-Jesus. And look to me and be saved, all you ends of the earth, for I am God and there is no other. I have sworn by myself, the word has gone out of my mouth in righteousness and shall not return. that to me every knee shall bow and every tongue shall take an oath. You guys know this last part. It's quoted in Romans and Philippians that every knee shall bow and every tongue shall confess, right? That's what the verse Paul is making reference to. The thing that we need to be careful with, and this is where Job's going, and he's going to get in trouble for it, is that because God has to allow things to happen, God therefore not just controls nature, but he controls what men do. In Amos 3:6, it asks this question, and this is, I'll come back to that in a second. If a trumpet is blown in a city, will not the people be afraid? Because the trumpet being blown, the shofar, was to call people in from the fields because there was basically an army coming their way, and they needed to get behind the city walls. All right? If there is a calamity in a city, will not the Lord have done it? What's Amos accusing? What is he saying? If something happened, God had to allow it. Right? In fact, what Amos is saying is that if there's a calamity in the city, he's saying God did it. Indirectly, right? So, what Job is saying, making the thing, is he's saying that, in a sense, God must also control evil. Now he's making an allegation against God. It's a bold statement, and Job may have just crossed the line saying it the way he did. He says that God controls. He's basically saying God controls both good and evil, implying that God can do evil things. Folks, let me put it this way. Nothing comes as a surprise to the Lord, right? But God doesn't make evil happen. Evil is the absence of God. When bad people, evil people do bad things, yes, God knows it's going to happen. But it's their choice and their decision to make it. Do you guys know that when we get into Exodus, it talks about hardening Pharaoh's heart, right? God didn't, that's a mistranslation. God didn't harden Pharaoh's heart. He allowed Pharaoh's heart to stay hard. He didn't intercede. Pharaoh hardened his heart himself. That's the same idea that it goes. Evil people will not seek God. God knows that they're going to do these things. God's going to use it for his plan and purpose. But God's not evil. And we have to be very cautious that we don't step over that line and blame God for things that he doesn't control. Are there things that God can't do? Yes, there are. He can't lie. He can't learn. He's chosen not to know whether you come to him or not. Right? Until Judgment Day. Now, he knows beforehand, but he's made that choice in his nature so that it is your decision to choose him, not the other way around. He chose you already. We're to come to him. So we can't charge God with evil, but that's where Job's getting on shaky ground. He's saying the good man and the evil man, they're both God's to do with as he wills. And that's where he's getting a little bit shaky because we have free will. We're not automatons. God does not control us like a couple of rock'em sock'em robots. In verse 18, he says, he looses the bonds of kings, binds their waists with a belt. He leads its priests, because during this time, the priestly class, not princes, but priests were a high class. Think of Egypt. Away plundered and overthrow the mighty. He deprives the trusted ones of speech and takes away discernment of the elder. He pours contempt upon princes and disarms the mighty. He's saying God will do what God will do because God controls everything. I need to stress, Job is speaking in bitterness here. All right? He's getting a little bit carried away. He's saying it's all God's divine providence. In verse 22, he uncovers deep things out of darkness and brings the shadow of death to light. Your sins will find you out. Verse 23, he makes nations great and he destroys them. He enlarges nations and guides them. He takes away the understandings of the chiefs of the people of the earth and makes them wander in a pathless wilderness. They grope in the dark without light, and he makes them stagger like drunken men. What this ending is basically saying, God is the one that builds kingdom and God's the one that destroys kingdom. He's not just in control of the individuals, he's also in charge of the nations. all of this is true, but he's starting to charge God with wrong. See, we have to be careful. Because how many times have you found yourself where your flesh led you down a path and that's where you screwed up and now you're in trouble? Did God know that you were going to get there? But did God allow you to choose it? I mean, did God kind of have to say, okay, I'll let him go down that and not put the bumper up? Actually, he could have, right? If he wanted to, he could. But whose fault is it? It's our fault. It's our free will. We did it. It was our flesh. You know? I remember about 2 years ago, a motorcyclist was injured and his girlfriend in Fallbrook by a drunk driver. The drunk driver turned right in front of him. And I was sitting there amazed because people were saying, well, that motorcyclist must have been speeding, doing 45 and a 35. I'm like, wait a second. That doesn't get past the point that it was a drunk driver that pulled in front of him. They're putting the blame in the wrong location, right? Many times we want to do that. How many before you knew God, did you shake your fist at him and ask why? I know I did. As we've gone through this, you've seen that Job is speaking with a bitter heart. He's mad at his friends for making a mockery of him. He feels that they're using this tragedy to elevate them. And their position is that, Job, you're being judged. And just confess. So on their side, you see that there's this part of a desire for him to be restored. But Job, in his anger, is now throwing their words back at him. He still doesn't believe what he's done is warranted that punishment he wishes God would show him. He's trying to say, who can challenge God? Who can challenge what God does? Who is mighty enough, in a sense, to ask God why he does certain things? What we're going to see in the book of Job is God's going to say, did you make the heavens? Did you make the earth? Who are you to ask me these questions? But now he's adding just a bit more to the narrative. He is reminding us that God is God and we are not. He begins to say that God will do what God needs to do in order to achieve his goals by orchestrating all the events that happen. But we have to be very careful that we don't charge God with wrongdoing and all of that. Folks, sometimes stuff happens. It doesn't come as a surprise to the Lord. Oftentimes comes as a surprise to us. But know that God's going to use it for his glory. God's going to use it for his purpose. And isn't that really what we want? Our time on earth here is not really about material things. It's to develop relationships. It's to learn to be a doulos, a bondservant to Jesus Christ. It's to learn what love is. It's to set an example for others. Because what we have here is just kind of a dirty wisp of smoke compared to what we're going to have in heaven. But we get just enough of a taste that what do we long for? What do we desire? God's not that concerned about our material well-being, but he is concerned about your souls. And he does just about anything that he can do to get and win a soul. I mean, there's not a single person who passes away that they can go to God and say, well, you didn't try. Nor did you try hard enough. The thing is that Job is correct that sometimes stuff happens. But never forget that when you find yourself in the midst of that trial, God's only ever had good thoughts about you. Same thing goes for Job. He loves you with an infinite love. He desires the best for you. And what's best for you is to be conformed into his image. The thing that Job is failing to realize is that there is a mediator that understands where Job's coming from. In haste to throw these words back at his friends, he's crossed a line. He's forgotten that God is the definition of grace and mercy. He's forgotten that God sees the whole picture. He has forgotten that God is the one that's in charge. He's also, go ahead. He was upright and walked God. He did those things. He wasn't perfect. He never claimed to be without sin. But his argument is that I didn't sin enough to warrant this. Right? And this is where God's going to come back and say, actually, one sin's far enough to separate. Okay? Not only that, but sometimes when we find ourselves in the trial, like Job's going through, it's so others see. That's really a big part of it. You may be witnessing to somebody who's never, ever read a Bible. Job's failing miserably. But I want you to contrast him with Jesus. What did Jesus say in the Garden of Gethsemane? What is the first thing he did? He prayed 3 times something should happen. Let this cup pass from me, exactly. Those were the key words, because when he said, but if it be your will, or your will, not my will, that set into events. It set into motion a chain of events that would take, over the course of the next day, would lead with him finally on the cross, with his blood being shed for our sins. Job's failing miserably. Jesus did it successfully. There's a bit of a contrast that's being played here. Do you guys see it? All right.
Isn't this why Zophar wants so much for him to confess, so that he can say, this is the crime that he committed to deserve
Right.
this punishment?
And isn't that what they were trying to do with Jesus? Didn't they want Jesus to confess some sort of sin? Because it says, cursed is anybody who's on a tree. Right. You guys are asking some great questions. I'll just end on this. Do you guys remember when Jesus and the disciples are talking and there's the blind man comes in? Jesus, what gets asked? Okay. No, what gets asked by the disciples asked Jesus, what sin did his parent, or who sinned that this man was born blind? Him or his parents? Now, it says that he was born blind. Therefore, that meant that he could sin while he was still in the womb. Okay? What did Jesus say? Exactly, neither. He was born blind so that this moment could take place, so that the glory of God can shine through him and I could heal him, is the idea. That God, before this kid was even born, had a plan for him so that on this day, when he encountered Jesus, he could choose to be healed by Jesus, and therefore God would get the glory. But even the disciples, and the mentality in the Middle East is still this way, that if something is wrong with you, medically, money-wise, whatever it may be, you must have sinned in order to cause that event to happen. Folks, God doesn't work that way. God makes beauty from ashes. Sometimes we get caught up in the events that create the ashes. But don't ever think for a second that Jesus is not by your side at that very moment that the calamities happen. Don't think that God didn't go before you. Don't think that God wasn't behind you. Don't think that God didn't have your flanks. Job's hedge of protection was never taken away, but it was thinned. Just like you have a hedge of protection about you. And God's angels are ministering spirits to you. Have you ever been going somewhere where that whisper and you go, okay, I'll take this way rather than this way, only to find out that there was a car accident or something? Do you think that happens by accident? No. But everybody else will tell you it's coincidence. The thing is that Job has done no wrong, but he's being accused of doing wrong because of what he's enduring. That's the way the world sees things. That's what the world wants. They think in karma. God's outside that. God is grace and mercy and love. No matter where you find yourself, know Jesus is grace and mercy and love. Never forget that, because some of you are going through some pretty hard trials right now. And you may be feeling alone. You may be asking, where is God in all of this? Folks, God never moved. He's right beside you, and he is grace, he is mercy, and he is love. Anytime. He never leaves us. In fact, if you feel far from God, it's because you moved. But the truth of the matter is that he went right with you, and if all you do would be to turn to him, you'll see him standing right there.